So this will be the final lesson on what we're calling the battlefield of consciousness. And as I said, today's lesson is based on Shimon bar Yochai, and we did last week on Akiva, right? So it follows that Shimon bar Yochai was a very close disciple, student of Akiva, and in fact, they were so close that people thought of them like father and son. So it was a very, very interesting relationship they had. Akiva, of course, is mostly first century, beginning second century, and Shimon bar Yochai is mostly considered second century. They had very different beginnings. As I said last week, Akiva had very humble beginnings, very, very poor, came from a family of converts, so his authenticism as a Jew was often brought into question by people who didn't like him, and so on and so forth, where the opposite was the case with Shimon bar Yochai. His father, Yochai, was a very famous scholar, very wealthy man, so he was born into wealth. His mother, Sarah, was part of Hillel's family, so very, very prominent in the religious circles, right? So he's born into a completely different situation than Akiva. And as such, kind of saw things a little differently, but they worked together. And as I said, Shimon bar Yochai became one of Akiva's favorite students. So like I said about Akiva, the same holds true for bar Yochai. There's a million directions we could go in, a million stories about his life and death, and all of them have enormous meaning. But I'm trying to focus on things that relate to this topic of battlefield of consciousness, right? So I want to bring us to what we call the cave experience with bar Yochai and his son. He had his son Eleazar, and what led to it, right? So by this time, I'm picking up the story after Akiva has been murdered by the Romans, and Shimon bar Yochai is continuing to study in the famous study hall that was there at that time, and you can imagine there's every time there's a new Caesar, things start to change. A new emperor, I should say. Things start to change for Judea, for Roman-controlled Judea. Everything goes bending upon the whims of the king, right? The emperor. So sometimes the emperor's not so bad. Sometimes they're horrible. So you can imagine this leads to discussions amongst the rabbis and the sages and the Jewish population. What do we think of these? What are we going to do? What's the best thing for us to do? And bar Yochai and two of his rabbinical buddies were talking in the study hall about this very topic. And so one was Rabbi Yehuda, and Yehuda's feeling was that if you look at the whole picture, the Romans really aren't so bad. Now remember, possibly, Yochai's favorite person in the world was murdered in a torturous way by the Romans, right? Maybe a year and a half before this conversation or so. So you know how he must feel. But Yehuda's espousing that, look, they improved the roads around here. They made a nice aqua system. We now have we have more money than we ever had before. There's bathhouses. There's all kinds of good restaurants. There's good theater. Why are we so, this new emperor, maybe he's not so bad. And the other guy was Rabbi Yossi, short for Yosef. Rabbi Yossi just remained silent. But Yochai was like, wait a minute, everything that they do that's good, they're doing for themselves. All they care about is themselves. They don't care about us for sure. They don't even care about their own poor people. All they care about is their own pockets, their own pleasures. There's prostitutes all over the place. All they care about is their own pleasure. They're extremely narcissistic. So this debate took place, and Rabbi Yehuda, you can understand his position. You can understand Yochai's position. And there was kind of an unwritten rule that what gets talked about in the shul stays in the shul, right? But there was some other student listening who decided he couldn't help himself but to leave and say, hey, Yochai feels this way about the Romans, and Yehuda feels that way, and Yossi's completely silent. What are we to do? Blah, 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 blah. So it all gets back, unfortunately, to the Romans, right? So the Romans decide that Yehuda's great, and we're going to support him in his endeavors and give him an audience. And so Yehuda is uplifted by this event. Yossi, they say, we're going to take Yossi and make him stay in his hometown. The story is he's exiled, but if you dig deeper into the story, it wasn't such a terrible exile. He was just saying, okay, stay home. We don't know what you're thinking. You remain silent during this debate. Yochai, however, is sentenced to death. So first he and his son hide out at the shul, and then that becomes too dangerous. So they go and they leave the shul and find a cave. And they go into the cave and they begin to study, meditate, and pray. And a spring of water comes miraculously in the cave, and a carob tree. So they live off, they're the first vegans written down about in history. They live off carob and spring water. And they stay in the cave for 12 years. Now, these stories, like all the other stories we know and all the different holy scriptures and everything like that, there's a lot of meaning in how long people stayed. And, I don't want to get too sidetracked into all that, but 12 is a special number. It keeps coming up like that, and it's not so important that it's a historical event. It's just a number. And we understand that 12 tribes of Israel, and the 12 cycles of the year, and the 12 constellations, they all mean something in these stories. But I'm not going to get sidetracked into that. They go into the cave and they begin to meditate, pray, and study. And they have a lot of wonderful experiences, crossing borders of consciousness to higher states of consciousness, as you might imagine. Then Elijah appears to them, and Elijah tells them, good news, there's a new emperor, and the decree to put you to death has been taken back. So it's safe to leave the cave. So that's great. So they get up, and there's lots of stories about what they did in the cave and their clothes, and they lived in the sand and all that. They get out of the cave, and as they're walking out of the cave, they see some Judean Jewish farmers tending their crops. And they both feel at that point, what are they wasting their time tending crops for? They should be doing the important thing for the tikkun of their souls, which they feel is obvious to pray, study, and meditate, because of all of the wonderful things they received from doing that. And God sustained them completely without effort. So why are they wasting their time? Now, as the story goes, as you cross these borders and get to higher borders of consciousness, your thinking comes from a finer and finer relative experience. So as we meditate, we start with the conscious thinking level and we go down deeper, 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 deeper like that to finer and finer fields of relative. The more you function from the finest relative, the more powerful your thoughts and actions are. So that's why you hear about miracles and stuff like that, because people are experiencing being very close to the Holy of Holies within themselves and experiencing that emanation from the Holy of Holies in their awareness, then their thoughts are filled with that power. So one could use any of the holy names or the Kabbalistic traditions, but if it's not connected to the essence, it doesn't have the same power. But having been in the cave for 12 years, eating carobs and drinking spring water and studying and praying and meditating, they were functioning from a very deep level of consciousness. So they come out and they see people and they immediately think, what is this? This is a waste of precious time, right? So the crops that they're looking at are immediately burned to the ground, right? So the farmers are like, what the heck is going on here? Then comes a bat kol to Shimon bar Yochai, which means an inner voice, a divine inner voice comes to him and says, you're in the cave for 12 years. You come out to destroy my creation. Get back in the cave. You missed something. So they go back in the cave and they meditate for another, pray and meditate and study for another 12 months. And then the experience of Hakma consciousness settles deeply into Shimon bar Yochai. And they come out of the cave. And this time they see the same farmers and doing their thing. And Eliezer hasn't quite yet experienced that Hakma consciousness. And his view begins to burn the crops. But his father immediately creates new ones. So this is deep in terms of the tree of life and the column of severity and the column of mercy. These two are representative in this story of these two things. So Shimon bar Yochai turns to his son and says, it's enough. You and I are enough. It is the way it's supposed to be. So now we have these two columns. So Shimon bar Yochai representing in this story the column of Chachma, the column of Chesed, and Eliezer representing this column of in our tree of life of Binah and Geburah, which is a more severe column as we understand it. And of course, this is all metaphor for us, but we experience this in the story. It's a beautiful story. And we go on to experience it because after he says, we are enough, they then continue to walk, and twilight Shabbat, Kabbalat Shabbat is happening. And a man is running, an older man, with 2 bushels of myrtle. And Eliezer stops him and says, what are you doing? Why are you running? And what's the hassle here? And why do you have 2 bunches of myrtle? And he says to them, well, I'm honoring the Shabbat with these. So it was a tradition to have this very beautiful scent of myrtle on Kabbalat Shabbat. And it opened the senses of smell, and it was beautiful, just like the Shabbat candles. It was tradition mostly, right? So Eliezer, still coming from a side of severity, says, why 2? it doesn't make sense to me, because why don't you just give one of those bunches to a poor person who can't afford a bunch at all? You don't need two. So Shimon Bar Yochai is just listening. And then the older man says, I have two, because one represents this commandment to obey the Shabbat, and the other represents just the lesson to remember it as holy. And one is an imperative to a legalistic imperative, which we must do, and another is a joy in remembering how holy this is. So if you look at the expression in Exodus of keeping Shabbat, it's different than the expression in Deuteronomy. So Shimon Bar Yochai is just thrilled with this explanation. And now we see the case of doubles, the case of creating, destroying, and creating, right? The whole concept of the dialectic that Jack is studying and sharing with us is there for you in the destruction of the crop, the creations of the crop, all of these different things. The essence carries through. So the Talmud tells us at that point that Shimon Bar Yochai turns to his son and he says, now we know the joy we have in that our brothers and sisters love the Torah as this man loves the Torah, and loves the Shabbat as this man loves the Shabbat. So his heart is just glowing. And in that glowing, Eleazar says, I'm in peace now. So there's a peace. So what's the story? The story for us is a story of acceptance in the battlefield of consciousness, right? So we have this beautiful opportunity to cross into higher states of consciousness. And we wrestle like Jacob wrestled between God and man. And we have questions that we don't have answers to. So we wrestle. The wrestling we don't always find answers in the wrestling. We don't find answers necessarily, but we do lose questions. Right? So instead of finding the answer to something, very often we lose the question in pure consciousness. But nonetheless, we have this wrestling. And as they must have wrestled for 12 years, right? We must have wrestled for 12 years. You think about it. Because in those days, everything wasn't all written down and nice and tidy as it is for us. We have the Jerusalem Talmud, we have the Mishnah, we have the Babylonian Talmud, we have the Midrash. We have so many nice and tidy things to look at. Many of the studying in the study halls were done through conversation. Okay, this rabbi says that, this rabbi says that. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? So all this wrestling in the cave, it wasn't as tidy as we might think it is. And they became explorers. It was easier to become an explorer. Everything wasn't on your device and so easy to find. So you had to be an explorer. You had to have that sort of understanding, right? And here we have the two sides. We have an example, I think, of the dialectic in that there is what is, right? This thesis. And then there's the opposite of it that burns it down, antithesis. And then there's a synthesis when it's recreated and it keeps its essence. So we have the union of male and female, of left and right in this tree of life experience as a result of what? Diving deep and engaging the essence. And then that Hakma consciousness, when we thrash things out and wrestle, and wrestling's in the world of Binah. But that consciousness brings us, our heart melts like Shimon Bar Yochai, and that consciousness brings that judgment side and the expectations we set up for other people, it brings that down into the heart level of Hakma consciousness and Chesed. And this is an example of it. So there's no narrative here about how one has to feel after one's done wrestling in the battlefield of consciousness. That's not the point. The point is we must engage the essence of who we are, which is divine. After engaging the essence, we have to go in like Akiva did to the orchard without expectations and without creating divisions. Yechidah is a unity form of consciousness. It's not creating divisions up or lower without creating others. And also, maybe the sweetest lesson of all is the one of Bar Yochai and Eleazar. What's to judge? This is God's creation. You don't spend 12 years in a cave of meditation to come out and say, how dare you be a farmer? So on that note, I'm going to say, let's go meditate and do the important thing, which is engage consciousness.